in the same way, I think part of it is just embracing that this is where we're moving forward as a state, and how can our teachers help us leverage the ability to do that. And I think that's...
I think that one of the biggest shifts from the 2010 to the 2017 adopted standards is that you're really talking about greater alignment with NGSS, and with that, with a closer alignment to the next generation science standards, it implies a methodological shift that's pretty profound. And that methodological shift is something that is very unsettling for teachers who may be more used to kind of a lecture recitation mode of teaching about science rather than doing science. And for us, I think in our district, we're really fortunate in that we have teacher leaders who they're in that wheelhouse already, where kids are very actively doing science and doing different things. And so I think it's really important within districts to leverage those teacher leaders who can help coach our other teachers. And so I think there's a real peer coaching that's necessitated out of this shift, and we need to find ways to give teachers the time, the support, and the resources to accomplish that.
Thing that we're trying to focus on, and I think probably as a district, but as an administrative team in general in our building, is we're trying to really build the capacity of our teachers. And when it comes to the next generation science standards, which Grand Island has been using for I think some longer time, it's a little bit easier for me coming into that. At the same time, it's about, for us, how do we help them grow as learners of the new ways of doing things and new methodology when it comes to that three-dimensional learning. And when we're going into classrooms, when we're going into teacher teams and PLCs, how can we kind of pose some questions? How can we ask teachers what do they need in order for them to be able to take their instruction to that next level, beginning with that planning phase, obviously, but also even before that, what do you need? What training can I help provide for you? How can we bring our instructional coaches to help with some of that? And part of that, I think, is building our own capacity. So when we're going in there, we're able to give meaningful feedback to teachers, not just be an onlooker for what is going on, but how do we take it to that next level? How do we help pose the questions? How do we help create the scenarios where our teachers are going to be able to grow in this new understanding of science and what science instruction now looks like? That's this worldview of using science and doing science, as opposed to, like you said, that memorization, that content delivery, but getting kids doing hands-on things and putting science at their fingertips.
So I would say number one focus is professional learning and building capacity, starting at whatever number of teachers that you can start with and just slowly over time increasing. But also for us, it's been a shift in the way that we deliver professional development. So our new standards call for students to construct their own knowledge. So we've been working really hard to provide professional development to our teachers in the same fashion, so that as we're delivering professional development, they are constructing their knowledge, and they're usually involved in collaborative sense making, just as our students should be in the classroom. And I would also add that we've been working pretty hard for the past year. It's taken quite a considerable amount of work, and I don't think you can underestimate how long the shift is going to take, because our teachers have never really taught this way in general, and they've never learned this way. So I think thinking that you're going to get them to that point in a year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, it's going to take more than that to help them get to the point where they can really help students construct knowledge in the meaningful way that our standards ask them to.
So really you're saying if it's going to take that long, culturally it's a shift to where we need to be okay as administrators with some struggle, some failure, and we need, that's really the big thing too, because if we want teachers to do things well, it's going to take time, and if it's going to take time, there's going to be mistakes, and we need to be okay with that. And I think that's a big key I try and live each day, is if you want teachers to do more for students, guess what? When they do more, it's not going to be perfect. It's not going to be ready to go, and
we need to be patient
Yeah.
and allow the process to happen. It's not going to happen overnight. We have to give them the time and the resources that is necessary to make it happen. And if we want it done right, because we're all trying to do it in the right direction, we need to give them the time to make that happen.
So I think there's also implications then in this discussion for administrators about a couple really key issues that are broader than science, but absolutely essential for science content area teachers. And one of them is retention, and another is teacher evaluation. And by retention, I mean we are going to struggle to build capacity over time if we can't retain our teachers. And so what these administrators, my colleagues up here on the panel are describing is making sure that we're creating a culture where risk-taking by teachers is welcome, it's accepted, and maybe even expected. And that means then that when we talk about teacher evaluation, we as administrators have some professional development to do to understand what doing science looks like in alignment with NGSS and our new state standards, and really what that means. Because oftentimes administrators are going to go into a classroom and from a really essentialist level, you're saying, am I seeing compliance here? You know, well, we need to move away from a model of teacher evaluation that says, is this person an efficient classroom manager? And instead be able to go in and say, hey, are we seeing high levels of student engagement? To reflect on what the math keynote said this morning, if you're talking about a real equitable learning environment, one of the themes of this conference, then you see students sharing ideas, you see students raising their voices, you see students connecting and collaborating with one another. Those are the sort of classroom environments we ought to be welcoming, but that implies doing some things differently in teacher evaluation than what we've done.
District, we have done trainings with all of our K-12 principals. So our science instructional team delivered professional development actually before and after our board adopted our standards. And with that, we basically told our principals, we have look-fors that our principals are supposed to be looking for in the classroom. And our look-fors became the science and engineering practices because aside from other things like collaborative sense-making, which principals should be kind of seeing across the board, some of what they would be able to see when they walk in would be students engaged in science and engineering practices. So that's sort of the road that we've gone down in terms of telling our teachers, hey, this is what they're going to look for when they come into your classroom. Because it eases a little bit of angst our teachers have about not being in a position to really feel like they are doing a great job at implementing NGSS because they aren't, you know, completely there yet. Right?
When we talk about the shift that, and it wasn't probably quite the same type of paradigm shift in instruction, but when math implemented new standards, just a couple of years back, it was that idea of what has changed and what can we accomplish kind of little by little. And touching, you know, on that same topic is that it can be overwhelming for teachers. All of these new standards, obviously, you know, what has changed, what has moved, what needs to be taught differently, all at that planning phase when you're stepping back, to being able to have those conversations, I think, with teachers that there needs to be some trial and error, but also how do we kind of take this chunk by chunk and, you know, what can we affect right now? What's the next step? And then making that map of where are we going to end up at the end, but long-term view, you know, and taking back the idea that this is this giant shift that's happening, but we don't need to get there this year. We don't need to get there, you know, next year even, but knowing that these standards are going to be here for 7 years, and then after that, possibly continuation of the practices that we've already kind of established. How do we get this long-term view of making that change? And I think sometimes that makes that job for the teacher a lot easier to say, okay, so here's where I start. Where am I going to end up is down the road, and I have a plan for that, but where do I start? what shifts can I make in instruction and in planning now that are going to lead me towards that long-term, overall change and paradigm shift that I need to. And I think especially with the new science standards, those teachers that are used to that traditionalist view of teaching, making those small shifts and looking for and planning for, what science and engineering practice am I going to focus on today? What cross-cutting concepts am I going to be focusing on today? Because the content is there. That doesn't change. Teachers are, they're familiar and experts at the content. So how do we make sure that, we're helping teachers feel confident enough to be able to try some new things, but also empower ourselves to know that this is what we're looking for. So when we go into a classroom and I'm giving feedback, it's not just on the evaluative method of what does the classroom look like, but what are you trying, where are you being innovative, and how can we celebrate that as administrators to continue that, that learning and that growth from the teachers.
I'll kind of jump off of that. I just had a conversation with our middle school science teacher, and this kind of happened last year too, where he was really nervous about the NSCAS, like how is this going to look on the assessment in a couple of years if we're flipping already to our new standards. So I think you may see some of your teachers wondering about that as well. So I think having that conversation and coming up with a plan on, are we going to do some of those assessment checks to make sure that they're still, within those lines of being able to do well on this next state test or the next couple of years with that too, and then still teaching what the new standards are. And so you kind of hit on a good point, opening up a discussion with your teachers and making them feel comfortable, I think, about it, and kind of working on a plan together and just being that support system for them.
Yeah, I think Tanner made a great point there. When we're talking about student achievement on standardized assessments, then we need to also be patient and we need to understand enough about this process administratively that we're able to articulate a message back to the public and to our stakeholders, because as we all know, we're living in an era right now where public education is under intense scrutiny related to accountability, and there are some people who have an agenda that's actually really pretty divisive and attack-oriented related to public educators. And yet we know, and we need to make sure that we're clear and consistent on messaging about this, that if student progress doesn't look as great initially, there's a time lapse period here where over time we need to and we will see individual student growth, and we need to be able to message that back to policymakers and key stakeholders who might otherwise initially question, well, what's going on, because some of these large-scale assessments may at first indicate that there's cause for concern. And the reality is that it's a shift pedagogically, methodologically, and over time achievement will improve because of those significant educational changes.
And this is coming from the language arts teacher inside of me probably. And, I walked into a 6th grade class and they're working on, supporting evidence with looking, coming up with that evidence, whether they're looking at charts and then they're having to make claims based on that, and then they're tying in so many different skills that are not necessarily science related, but those skills that they're getting, that they're going to get, will cross over into social studies. They'll cross over into their reading, to their English, and to their math classes. So I really like that shift because I felt like when I was teaching, I had the science teacher coming to me and there was always that question, weren't they supposed to be writing 5 to 7 sentences in a paragraph or something, or aren't they learning how to cite evidence and explain why that evidence supports that? Well, they come into that science room and it's like that all went out the window for some reason. So I know in the district I'm at currently within our PLCs, whether that be in the science collaborative team or in the 6th through 12th grade ELA collaborative team, and we are smaller, so it's a little bit different than some of the bigger districts, but we are crossing some of those ideas together, so now we know what to expect when those kids go from a 6th grade class in science to reading. There is a cohesiveness with those teachers on the language that they're using, so that creates a common language that students are not becoming confused with. We know the sentence starters, the transitions, how we're going to cite text, and how they're going to explain how that that evidence supports all that. So I really like that shift because I think it's going to help schools as a whole and kids understand that, hey, I'm learning this in science, I can still apply this to my other classes.
I think to build off what you said, I think the exciting part is we live in an age where it's very easy to get answers because you can just get the answer. But the beauty of science is that it's everything in between. It's the process to actually get to the answer. And I think these place greater emphasis on that, like being a scientist, the nature of science. The whole reason the whole reason everything exists really is we're curious, and we've been curious for centuries. And I think sometimes I'm worried that we lose some of that curiosity with students especially, and hopefully this is an attempt to bring it back around and support it through science.
So you're saying it might be hard to get teenagers to ask questions. Kindergartners are a little more apt.
They all have things to say, but they all have things to say and they all have things to discuss, and then it's a way to get it out of them because they all desperately, this is more of a relationship thing, they all desperately want to talk regardless of their background. We will sometimes say, well, it's kids of lower SES who have these struggles, but if you talk to enough teenagers in high school, there's some common themes of they want adults to listen, they want opportunities to talk, and we can support that through academics. It doesn't have to, I mean, it's I have a voice, here's what it's more of a social thing, but there's some excitement in there where the teaching can kind of lead to that, where we are hearing more from our students, and our students are doing more.
I look at it as an opportunity for some of my older teachers to get re-excited about what they do. Just re-excited about teaching. And whether it's science or math or whatever, it's just a new way of thinking. And, you know, it doesn't mean you have to throw out everything you've ever done, just a new way of thinking about how to do it.
Right.
So, and that's for all subject areas. It doesn't matter if it's just science or not.
Sure. I think for me, you know, to build off of that, the celebration or the excitement that there's this new possibility of learning, not just for our students, but also our teachers. And when you talk about igniting that excitement in kids, you know, at the middle level and then at secondary, sometimes that's when science excitement fizzles because of the change that happens, you know, from being elementary kids and being excited about science, learning about, you know, rocks and learning about nature and space, and then you get to, you know, the middle school secondary phase and it starts to go away because of the nature of the way that science has been taught. So changing that, I think, is a great thing that is going to be able to bring more excitement to our students, but also because it's going to require a shift in our teachers, is we're going to have now adults who are becoming, you know, these lifelong learners of how do I get better at my craft to help these kids now, you know, engage them in this work. So I think it's that paradigm shift that had to happen at the top from the standards level in order for our students to gain those benefits as well. And so I think that's the big excitement for me, is that we're creating now new levels of engagement in science and students because teachers now have to learn some new things that are exciting.
And that ties back to what John said about evaluation and us understanding that it's a process, that it's going to take a lot of time to really get this to, you know, go where we want it to go.
When the connection, I think, that you talked about, you know, I was in a session earlier about scientific literacy. The standards, the way that they're written, obviously tie into, you know, those different disciplines, but the standards themselves aren't the shift, but it's the basis for how do we connect what science is doing to language arts, to social studies, to different areas, but it's building that capacity of teachers, and that's where we have to make sure that we're continuing in our learning so that teachers continue in their learning and so that we keep that needle going in the right direction.
And I would just add that the thing that excites me, aside from students behaving like scientists, because that's exciting, but the other piece of it is that I truly believe that these standards will create more equitable systems for our students. So in the past, you know, a lot of people have been sort of vocab heavy up front, right? Teach the kids the vocab. They don't have anything to hang it on, no understanding to hang on those ideas, right? And so, to me, these new standards are asking you to not do vocab right away. Give students experiences first, let them explore, and then introduce them to the vocab when they're ready to use it. And that's exciting. I mean, that's just one example of how I feel like they're more equitable than our previous standards.
That kind of leads me, I might put you on the spot first. Who, like, any commercial professional resource, any non-commercial professional resource, any, kind of coming back to the first question, who are you using as a resource? And I know Omaha's been talking with Oki Lee, who is very high in the area of helping emerging language learners in science. So if you're really bad at language, but you're really good at science, how do they show that they're good? And so I piggybacked on Omaha, and when she's coming to Omaha the day before, now she's coming to Lincoln. So I'm trying to leverage some of these national professional networks. Is there anybody that stands out to you that you've attended, that the state has brought in, that you brought to your district that's really sticking out as a good resource? And I'll put a disclaimer. I don't think there's one recipe or one turnkey out there that's going to get you to 3D. You're going to have to find what works. There's lots of good access points, but I've heard a lot of the people that even could profit personally by saying they're the only answer say that. So I think it's okay to use different people and different models, as you're probably seeing in a much broader sense on other content areas. But who are you using? What are you using?
Yeah, so I would say that our journey probably started with NSTA and NCELA. I would say that those are the places that we went to get the best information. And really, those are the places that we went and started to build relationships with people like Oki Lee. Dr. Shaban is actually the one who had the opportunity to reach out to her. And yes, she is coming to visit our school district in January. But aside from NSTA and NCELA, which I would highly recommend if you have science teachers or leaders who might be leading folks in the future with our new standards, let them go to NSTA and NCELA, because the networks that they have in place for people are just fantastic. NSTA was the first place that I learned about AMNH 5-tool professional development. We have used that model to develop curriculum for every course K through biology, the first unit. It was a tremendous amount of work, but had we not attended NSTA, I don't know if we would have gotten there. And so I would say national conferences, state networks, like you said, we work fairly closely together, OPS and LPS, and we're really willing to help anybody at this point, because it is such a monster, right? It is a mountain. And if we don't help each other, we're not benefiting all the kids in Nebraska. So I really feel like we need to work together to scale the mountain, and because at the end of it are kids.
I think being a smaller school, I need larger schools like you to be a resource for me, because we're limited. I mean, we're out in western Panhandle, Nebraska, and there's not a lot of real close by available, resources for that. So just having those connections is a huge part. That's why I come to things like this, and I have, because it allows me to meet people and to make connections and to bring some resources back to my teachers.
Yeah, at Norris, because Lincoln and LPS, they're by annex part of us, like every month, we just never hesitate to call LPS. So WWJD, what would James do?
Stay back at you.
Actually, I know I think it's important to delineate that. I don't think any off-the-shelf resource is probably what's going to get us there. It's really going to be teacher learning and empowering teachers to work with one another. So we're doing that. I know we can always do more with that.
Friday nights when I'm at a football game, I'll go up to a group of third graders, and I just did this a couple of weeks ago. I go, "What's going on in science? You guys liking it?" And they go, "It is the best right now. It's so much better than last year. We're figuring out how this train is balancing using magnets." And I heard one key phrase there, figuring it out. And you touched on letting them be a scientist, And that to me has been really, really cool to see the elementary students embrace it. And then, from the middle school side of things, I'm looking forward to when those kids get up there in the middle school too, because they'll have that kind of background knowledge already on some of that that good foundation that they're going to be able to build upon within the middle school. So
The resource is not the curriculum, and so, for me, it's those networks that teachers build. When you talk about attending some of these conferences, or you talk about putting them in collaboration with each other, with other middle schools, other teachers, also cross-curricularly, what can you learn from each other, and what are you observing that can help you? Year one was very much more rote, lesson by lesson, here's, what's coming next, and how do we learn from that? Year two has been more, I think, exploration of how can that resource help us and help, our students learn the content without doing that lesson by lesson approach with it, and what else can we infuse and can we bring in when we expand our professional understanding of the content and of just science instruction in general.
Privileged to be on this panel. Also really excited that NATS is involved in steering this discussion about implementation of the standards as well as a commitment to equity. I think that's great and awesome. Just awesome to see.